topic. So thank you, everybody, for being here. I do want to let you know, first of all, that we're going to be recording this meeting so that anybody who wasn't able to meet it can watch it after the fact, to let you all know that. So thanks for being with us. We're really excited to have everyone here for our first kickoff meeting for our Technical Advisory Committee for the CFEC Model Code project. And it's a gorgeous day outside for some of us. So thanks for being with us. And in a virtual room, we'll try to make it as exciting as we can. And so that you'll have a great hour and a half spent with us, even if it's sunny outside. So just going to get us going here. My name is Pauline Ruegg, and I'm a planner at Cascadia Partners. I'm based here in Portland, and I'm the project manager for this project. And I'm going to share my screen here. We're going to walk you through a series of slides today. We've got about half of our day is a presentation to you, and then about half of it is some discussion with you all. So first of all, who are we? Who's in the room? So I'm going to introduce myself briefly, and I'm going to hand it off to Alex Joyce, who's our principal in charge. So my name's Pauline, as I mentioned, and I am an urban planner with a background in code. I've worked in the government. I've worked in the private sector now for about 15 years, and I've done a lot of housing and code work, and worked with several of your cities before. And I'll be the project manager for this project. And Alex, would you go ahead and introduce yourself, please?
Yes. Hi, everybody. Alex Joyce, managing partner at Cascadia Partners, and oversee a lot of our housing policy related work and our pre-development services. So I focus on actually implementing where housing policy touches down on the ground and getting projects moving in real life. Back to you, Pauline.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. And we also have with us today from our firm, we have Jamin Kimmel, who's I consider a subject matter expert in all things code, really any aspect of the code. And then Ray Haggerty, who has a background in development. So Ray has actually worked for Orange Spot and affordable housing developers. And so she really understands how practitioners end up using the code once it's implemented. So that's an important perspective we want to have. And then Tara Sorrells is going to be supporting us throughout the whole project, and you'll be hearing from her as well. And I'd like to give a chance just for our DLCD project team, Bill and Cody, to introduce yourselves. So handing it off to you, Bill.
Yeah, thank you, Pauline. Hi, everybody. I'm here, Bill Holmstrom, Land Use and Transportation Planning Coordinator here at DLCD. We have actually two other folks here at DLCD. I'll let them introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. Cody Meyer, Land Use and Transportation Planner with DLCD. I'm the project manager for this project. So if you have any logistical questions or issues, go ahead and get in touch with me. Otherwise, any kind of substantive issues would be Bill and Kevin.
And I'm Kevin Young. I'm a senior urban planner with DLCD. Good afternoon.
Great, thank you. So as Cody was mentioning, we just want to clarify for everyone the team roles within our project team. So Cascadia Partners is going to be responsible for creating all the materials that you'll see. We'll be drafting the code, we'll be putting together packets for the TAC meetings, and we'll be sending that out to you, as well as taking in any of your comments and edits and refining work products. We'll also be facilitating all the TAC meetings. So if you have any substantive project questions, please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll make sure to keep Alex and everyone else in our team informed. But Cody is going to be coordinating all of our TAC meetings. So if you have questions on specific material that you didn't receive, or if you can't make a TAC meeting or anything along those lines, feel free to email Cody, and he's going to help coordinate all of the TAC members. So that's what each of us will be doing. But we'd like to take a second to get to know all of you as our TAC members. We are really excited to have you all participating and really value your experience and your knowledge. So I'd like to ask each of you to do a brief introduction, and that would just be sharing your name and the city you work for and your position there. And to keep it simple, I'm going to go in alphabetical order. So I'm going to ask Anne to introduce herself, and then after that, Anne, if you could pass it to Brian.
Yeah, Ann Catlin, City of Albany. I'm the Comprehensive Planning Manager, and I'm excited to be on this TAC, and I've been with the city for quite some time. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. It's Brian Martin. I'm Long Range Planning Manager at the City of Beaverton. Nice to see you all.
Hi, I'm Carla Palladino, Principal Planner for the City of Medford in the Long Range Division. Thanks for having me.
I'm Chelsea Hartman. I'm a Senior Planner with the City of Springfield, and yeah, excited to be here.
Hi, I'm Derek Severson, Senior Planner with the City of Ashland.
Hi, I'm Eunice Kim, Long Range Planning Manager, City of Salem. Happy to be here.
I'm Krista Mays. I'm with the City of Talent. I'm the Community Development Director here.
Hi, I'm Paige West with Rogue Valley Transportation District. I'm the Senior Planner and also participated in the Rulemaking Advisory Committee for CFEC about 2 years ago now.
Hi, I'm Phil Naimany with the City of Portland. I work in the zoning code development group for Bureau of Planning and Sustainability, and looking forward to seeing what we come up with.
Good afternoon. Ryan Emerson, Senior Planner with the City of Corvallis.
Hi, everyone. Steve Coper. I'm the Assistant Community Development Director for the City of Tualatin.
Great. And I think Skylar Warren is not able to join us today, but is also a member of the TAC. So really thrilled to have you all here again. And we're going to lean heavily on your knowledge and really try to engage you in this process as we move forward. So today we have a full agenda. First, we want to just provide an overview of CFEC, and then we'd like to walk through this project, what its objectives are, give you a bigger picture of the schedule and the tasks and where we're going. We'd like to clarify for you all what's the role of the TAC and what will we be asking you to do over the course of this project. And then we'd like to spend the bulk of our time presenting a framework for how we're understanding and thinking about the code topics that will make up the model code that we're producing. And then lastly, we'll just leave you with a sense of what the next steps are so you know where we're going. A couple of meeting protocols up front. I think it's always important just to remember in a digital meeting, it's easy to get distracted, multitask, do other things. We have you 5 times, and we're really looking forward to getting as much of you as we can during those times. So we ask that you try to participate, to stay present, eliminate any distractions. And again, we'll keep you engaged as much as we can. There's many different ways and approaches to code. And so we would encourage everyone here, there's no one right way, and everybody will be exploring these different standards or approaches over the course of the project. So we ask that you listen and you remain aware of how you're speaking and how that affects the other people around you. And lastly, I just want to let you know that I personally am trying to do less multitasking. And so to that end, we're really going to work on not using the chat function as much as having you all participate in the dialogue. So we ask that if you have a question about the topic that we're, the substantial content of what we're talking about, raise your hand. And then we'd love to have you jump in that way. We'll be watching and the chat function, but really that's for more specific technical questions. So we ask that you really help us out with that. All right, so CFEC. I just want to provide a quick overview up front about what is CFEC, what are the policy goals, where do they apply? Many of you have heard about this for years as it's been being developed, and it's just good to all get on the same page and start from the same place. So what is the model code desired outcomes for CFEC? Fundamentally, we see it as trying to change land use patterns. It's looking to move away from those sprawling, more suburban density land use patterns that really prioritize and make everything structured around car use. We're looking to create standards that will move to a different way of that people are able to live and move through neighborhoods. So there's many different choices, whether that's how you move through a neighborhood, the type of travel, the mode that you take, if you're going to ride your bike or you're going to have your kids ride their bikes and feel safe doing that. And then you've got many different choices for how to move through a neighborhood. You could cross at many different safe crosswalks. there's safe and comfortable ways to move through a neighborhood, and it's these mixed use districts that are active and full of people and connections. So that's the overall objectives of what CFEC is trying to accomplish. What does that look like on the ground? I think we try to always approach our code work from a very place-based perspective. And yeah, Alex, do you want to go ahead and jump in?
Yeah, just a quick technical note. I think your slides are getting cut off on the right. If you could stop sharing and go into presentation mode and then reshare. I think maybe you're sharing the whole window.
Absolutely. Yes.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Okay, give me a second to do that. Hence
Also
why
just
I'm trying.
demonstrating best practice by raising my hand. Modeling good behavior.
Thank you. And also why I'm trying to not multitask, because I just can't really pull it off these days anymore. All right, give me 1 second to get the right. Okay, Alex. Here we go. Okay, back on track. Thank you. So we try to always, again, approach code really from a place-based perspective. So what does it look like when you're moving through these places? If they have new code put in place, you know, it's about how you walk down a sidewalk, how you meet your neighbors when they're in front of your house, how you catch the bus, how you feel as you're doing those things. Do you feel safe, comfortable? Do you enjoy walking through those spaces? And so that starts to cue us in the types of needs that the standards will have to address. So we always start from that perspective. I do think it's really important to pause and cover the umbrella of CFEC, because there's a lot of different moving parts and pieces. And this, just to be honest, confused us at the beginning of this project, as I'm sure it may have confused many people, as there's so many different objectives going on here. So there's a couple parts that we wanted to highlight. So there's the parking aspects of CFEC, which is the parking A and the parking B aspects. And many of you have already done this or are in different phases of this. And that's around updating the parking requirements and how you manage your parking. So that's a huge aspect from the transportation side of things and land use planning. There's also the climate friendly areas, and that's a multi-step process. And many of you are in the process of doing that right now and are at various stages of that. And so we just want to clarify, there are some parts of the OARs, particularly the 0330 land use regulations, that are relevant to that effort. And there'll be aspects of climate friendly areas that have some redundancy or similar topics. And we'll clarify that a little bit more in a couple slides. But that's also something that's going on through part of CFEC. And then specifically in this project, we're looking at the land use regulations in the OAR, and that's 0330 and 0405. And we'll be focusing in on walkable design standards. Now, there's different timing for when each city has to adopt those land use regulations. Most likely they'll be done with a major update to your TSP. Again, some aspects of the land use regulations are going to be covered under climate friendly areas, but it's a process and there's many moving parts and pieces. So it's important for us to understand what all the parts are and what they are and when they're due. So to be very clear, and we always want to turn to our graphics to help us be very clear. So we started with this question of where do these 0330 land use regulation code changes apply? So as you can see on the left here, there's the climate friendly areas, which are specific designated areas. But the land use regulations that we'll be looking at in this project are covering the entire city. They're covering the entire area that's within an urban growth boundary. And so that really helped cue us in on our range of areas that we're looking at. And it's a challenge for sure to create standards that can apply in a huge range of different land use districts. Now, the when question is long-term, right? These zoning changes are implemented. They don't affect land uses that are already development that's already occurred. So it's a long-term movement away from those more suburban land use patterns that you're seeing here of those cul-de-sacs and what we call loops and lollipops to more connected walkable patterns. So it's a longer term goal that we're headed toward. A couple of important caveats. So as I was mentioning, since it's looking at all the area within a UGB district, there's different zones within that. And so as we're starting to think about the land use regulations, we're thinking about a full range from those low density residential uses, low density residential zones, all the way up to your downtowns, your commercial mixed use areas, and everything in between there. So we're keeping that whole range in mind as we're creating those walkable design standards. And there'll be differences in the standards based on the different contexts. We're also focusing on the sites or the lots or parcels. So we'll be looking at land use regulations in the private realm, but we're definitely very interested in that place where those two realms intersect. So this project will not be looking at street standards or landscape standards, things that are in that public realm, but we'll be looking very much at those points where they intersect. So as you can see here, we're looking at where the buildings are on the lots, but that point when a car would cross through the street and over into the lot. That's a very interesting point of intersection and something that's critical for us to look at and address in standards for a truly safe and comfortable walking environment. And as I mentioned, we're looking toward influencing new development, not requiring existing development to change. So a little bit more specifically about this code. This code project, what are the objectives and how are we going to go about doing the work? So this project is looking at creating a comprehensive resource for all cities and jurisdictions that are required to comply with the OAR regulations. And we'll be creating a resource to support local implementation of land use regulations that'll address site design and connectivity in your codes. Now, when we're creating that code, we have some really important objectives, and we'll be creating code language, first of all, that's clear and objective. Now, it may not be required in, let's say, a commercial zone to be clear and objective, but it's always best practice to have a clear and objective and visually centered code so that it's very clear for both people using it and people administering it. And I think that's also, we always consider that ease of the users and thinking about how you're administering a code. There's a broad range of city sizes, the number of people that you have within your department to administer a code. And we want to create code that's the easiest possible for you to use and for someone who's applying and using that code so that they understand it. That'll get the best outcomes. And we also want to reflect the best practices approaches. So many cities have different ways that they're already going about some of these topics. For example, maybe a city has a really great parking lot design standards part of their code. We want to reflect those best practices and move the whole state of the practice forward and take into account the best things that are being done to try to get at those CFEC objectives. At our firm in particular, we always consider the financial feasibility and the impact of standards on eventual development. So we want to think through how the standards that we're creating would impact potential development. Housing costs continue to increase, and any possible way to think through how to reduce those costs is really important to keep in mind. So that's something that we think about when we're creating code. And then lastly, the code standards that we create will be compatible with the model code for small cities. They'll follow the same format, the same structure. So again, that gets us ease of use and consistency and clarity in our work product. So the toolkit that we'll be creating for you, and there'll be different ways to use it. If a smaller city wanted to adopt the standards that we're going to create right off the shelf, that would be a great way to go ahead and be in compliance with the OAR regulations for CFEC. So that's one approach, is to adopt the standards that we create, and then you'll be in compliance. Now, there may also be cities that are working on crafting their own standards and want to modify things or go a little bit further. Again, this toolkit will provide a starting point and provide information, and also the process that we'll go through with the TAC will provide clarity on how to meet the OAR intent and different approaches to do that. So it's a toolkit that can be used in different ways based on whatever jurisdiction's needs are. And I just want to clarify, again, you all have this in your packet, but these are the specific sections of the OAR that we'll be writing walkable design standards to address. So all the standards that we create will be providing a way to be compliant with these sections, and you have them for reference in your packet. And we're excited to be, I'd say, your tour guide or your cruise ship director. We'll be walking you through what these are and providing you with a full access way to have everything, all your needs met for these specific regulations. How are we going to go about writing our model code? We're going to be triangulating and looking at 3 key resources. So again, I mentioned many of you have existing standards in place. As code practitioners, you're constantly looking to push the practice forward. You're creating a slight tweak. You're going back and changing one standard that you have in place and trying to make it better. You're thinking of a new way to go about something. And we want to have a way to share all that information and to gather that, have you learn from each other and reflect the best practices of what cities are already doing. And then we also want to look to nationwide, what are best practices? What are the new and emerging ideas in code for advancing those walkable design principles? And then lastly, there's already a lot of great resources. I think it's something that's very unique about Oregon is that DLCD already has some great resources for us, whether it's the small city model code or the commercial and mixed use development standards. We already have some of these resources that we can build from and go further with. So we'll be contrasting and comparing all these different approaches and specific code standards. And with your advice and input, we'll be finding one pathway forward to compliance to those OAR regulations. And that's where you all come in, the TAC. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Alex.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about what the role of this group is going to be, the TAC, the Technical Advisory Committee. Next slide. So yeah, there's the attendees here represent a lot of different conditions on the ground that we want to make sure are captured in the, the potential of the ranges of different standards that are presented in the model code, so that it's applicable not just for the larger cities, but also for smaller towns. We want to crowdsource the approaches that you all are taking to these different topics that we're talking about regulating. Because there are some that have been updated more recently and maybe working well, or some folks are sort of struggling with the way that they're written today, and we want to daylight some of those opportunities and challenges with this group. And then if we're bringing in outside ideas, best practice approaches, we want this group to be a sounding board for how you think that would actually get operationalized on the ground to crowdsource the model approaches, right? The best that we can put forward in a model code. And then importantly, as we get into the different versions of the drafts and then the final, this is a group that we hope will take the time to review those products so that they can be the best resources as you all pivot into implementation. And then always at the top of our minds are, how the standards that we're talking about advance the broader set of state and local objectives around housing, equity, and transportation. Next slide. So we have, as Pauline mentioned, we have 5 opportunities to engage with you all directly. There will be opportunities for you to engage in your own time with some of the materials, and we'll talk a little bit about your first homework assignment later on in the presentation. We know that everyone's very busy, and we're going to try and keep your input focused on the highest priority items, which, there's a wide range of things that the model code will cover. but there's a limited amount of time and a limited amount of bandwidth in everyone's life. So one of our key focuses today is to help sort of hone in on what are those items that we need to chew over together so we can focus these limited opportunities. The project stretches out into into August. And so it's a fast burn, and but it's not the last time that this topic will come up. It's intended to set a productive stage for local implementation of these code standards. So we anticipate many communities pivoting pretty quickly into the actual implementation of the relevant code topics. There's a couple of online survey opportunities. The first one we'll talk about today, which is really about soliciting input from you all. And then there's another online survey that's related to getting a broader set of stakeholder input once we have draft code concepts in place. So buckle up, it's a fast project, and we really appreciate the attention you're able to direct toward it. Anything else, Pauline, you want to say on the schedule?
No, I think that's it. Thanks, Alex.
Next slide. Great. So there's a theme to each of our times together. So today is sort of 2 parts orientation. So it's a little bit more one-way communication than what we anticipate for the other TAC meetings. There's a lot of sort of level setting about what we are doing and what we're not doing, and discussion around prioritization. But the rest of the TAC meetings we anticipate to be a lot more conversational and us receiving your input. So TAC meeting number 2 is really learning from you all. So synthesizing some information that we hope to gain from a survey, which we'll talk about, and then talking about what you're doing on the ground around these code topics that's working well and what's not working very well, so that we can hopefully crowdsource some best practices from among these jurisdictions. TAC number 3 will be about presenting best practices and the trade-offs involved in different approaches to regulating different aspects of walkable urban design, and then how those best practices may or may not work in terms of local implementation, both in administration, but also interpretation by the folks who use the code. TAC 4 is really reviewing draft code, right? So, and providing you with a sense of what the larger stakeholder feedback is on what we've drafted. So it's kind of an opportunity to sign off on the major components of what will become the model code. And then the model code will be written up into a draft form, and between TAC 4 and 5, you'll be able to review that. And then after TAC 5 is really when we finalize the model code itself, and it becomes a public facing document. So today, what is the purpose of today? So in a minute, we're going to talk about the project framework. So there's a lot of policy objectives baked into the OAR 0330, and we want to unpack those and frame them into some topics, and also frame them in space and talk through those things, identify the set of highest priority topic areas that this TAC process can chew over. We can't chew over everything, so we need to flag things that are worthy of discussion or need more discussion. Agree on a set of evaluation criteria, a set of things that we can come back to and always ask ourselves, is this standard in our working approach to how to regulate this issue compliant with our evaluation criteria, our measuring sticks? And there's going to be a lot of opportunities to provide input, both right after this meeting, but then over the course of the space between these TAC meetings as well. Next slide. All right, so let's dig into it. So we've defined a framework for code topics, and we always want to sort of ask the question of not just what is the right code standard, but what are the right regulatory dials and the necessary regulatory dials to achieve the outcomes in terms of placemaking that we want. Let's stay focused on the outcomes, and then we can back into what the right regulatory code standards are to achieve those. So we want to make sure that we're covering all of the topics that are necessary to get the right outcomes. So let's dive into it, Pauline. Next slide. So if any of you all have had a chance to read through the OARs, they are very aspirational set of outcome-oriented language that set out some requirements in a variety of different contexts around how to achieve the land use objectives that support the broader CFEC goals. Next. Our objective for this process is to take the policy guidance and formulate it into a zoning friendly format that ultimately can become compatible with the model code. But for the purposes of our conversation and our working together, to make it a little easier to chew through this, we've broken down these concepts in two different ways. One is sort of spatially. So there's certain standards that apply to a building, there's certain standards that apply to a block, and there's certain standards that apply to a broader district. And the further you get down this, sort of Russian doll kind of nested hierarchy here, the more relevant these standards are when a larger piece of land is being subdivided and developed into blocks and into lots. The building level and to some extent the block level are relevant in the cases of redevelopment in existing urbanized areas, et cetera, but not all standards apply at each of these levels. So we're going to break them down in terms of their space, but we're also going to break them down thematically as well. Next slide. I'm not seeing the next slide. Oh, there it is. So thematically, there's 5 topic areas that we've identified where a number of these code issues intersect. So there's a stated, and they relate to the objectives as defined in the OAR. The pedestrian-oriented site design, that's a pretty big topic area. How do we design new places and redevelopment of property in a way that can prioritize pedestrians and bicyclists and transit users? So that there's a whole host of zoning related and code related topics that intersect there. Compact development patterns is a stated objective, and compact is another word for density. So we need to unpack that here in just a second, but because there's a number of zoning related issues that could intersect and support compactness. Connectivity relates to how lots are connected to one another. It relates to the larger frequency of different types of transportation connections, and then how each the uses are connected to one another, major uses or major destinations like transit. Access and circulation, so how do you get from one end of a district to another? How do you get across a single lot if it has parking or buildings, and those kinds of things. And then transit, so there's some special considerations around lots that are or sites that are adjacent to high frequency transit that we need to tackle. The one that is probably the most has the most direct connection to zoning standards, but needs a little bit of clarifications for the purposes of this project is the compact development patterns. So I want to go to the next slide and then pause on it for a second. So compact development is an objective at the state and local level for most of our communities, and at the state level certainly, and has been implemented in a variety of fashions through various state initiatives in one way or another related to housing in particular. And could be things like density or height, right? And then there's other things that influence compactness, like parking ratios, which we've already mentioned are in some stages of being taken care of locally. For the purposes of a site design and a walkable design process like ours, we have flagged several zoning related standards or themes here that are we think worthy of consideration in this process. But because there's a number of different ways this could go, and because there's a number of other initiatives outside of just the bounds of this project that are attempting to tackle some of these things, we wanted to pause on this topic in particular and crowdsource, whether we've got any gaps in the types of standards that we ought to be considering for this process. So we've flagged lot size, setbacks, lot coverage, and landscape percentage as sort of more walkable design related code standards that we think would be worthwhile to tackle in this project, and with particular emphasis on commercial zones, since some of the compactness related standards for residential areas have been tackled by other state initiatives. So Pauline, Jamin, before we open it up to broader discussion, is there any other framing or considerations you all want to add to this discussion slide?
I don't have anything to add. I think I'd just be interested to see from the TAC members, if you can look forward and envision a model code that addressed these topics with the intent of providing a pathway to compliance with the OAR language that requires for cities to encourage compact development patterns. How do you envision using that model code with the idea that these standards would intersect with many standards that are zone district specific? So they aren't particular, like many of the other standards here are apply citywide to all zone districts and usually don't vary much by zone district. While these standards vary significantly by zone district. So that's one thing we're just trying to get our head around, is how should the model code address these standards that are typically embedded in zone districts.
And just a reminder, you can use the little reactions button down at the bottom to raise your hand, and we'll just kind of go as best we can in order of hand raises. Anyone having any comments on compactness and how we should be conceiving it? There we go. Got some hands coming up.
This is Anne, City of Albany. I think because the OARs break stuff out by city size, we might look at, and then minimum heights in the CFAs, at least primary, and then secondary. If we have secondary ones, which we will, we can have a height of 50 feet. So maybe if we're looking at compactness, trying to achieve a certain number of stories or a certain height, we might, that might work across jurisdictions, because everyone of a certain size has to have, a ability for buildings to be at least 50 or 60 feet high. I mean, that's one way to think about it. I think there's just different scales of urban form, and it needs to reflect the different size cities and what development could actually be built and supported in the marketplace.
Okay, I don't remember the order, and my screen, everyone's hand got raised at the same time. So apologies if I'm getting the order here wrong. But Derek, you want to go next?
Sure. I think things to consider would also be separation between buildings, which I think a lot of us have in our codes or have recently had. In Ashland, we've had a separation based on the height of the buildings, which then you're breaking up blocks to the point where you have big gaps that get to compactness and pedestrian friendliness. And then also, while we've gotten rid of parking ratios, parking lot design, driveway placement, and circulation placement, so that, for instance, in our downtown where we haven't required parking since the 80s, we also want to control where driveways are going, so you're not creating, two driveways between two buildings to create big gaps.
Great. Thanks. And I see Phil's hand is up.
Yeah, I'm just trying to unmute and turn on my camera again. A couple other things I was just thinking of is City of Portland's done kind of a combination. We may have minimum setbacks in areas, but other places might have maximum setbacks. So there's the idea of that, certain portion of the building has to be closer to the street in those cases. In some of our plan districts that we want to, foster a little more higher level redevelopment, we've also had minimum floor area ratios. They may not get to the level of the CFEC minimum height and floor area requirements, but they were essentially to try to remove the idea of the, a single story building surrounded by parking. The landscape one has been a little bit kind of difficult because for us, there's been a lot of competing needs. Sometimes landscaping is an aesthetic value. Sometimes the landscaping helps with stormwater. So, we actually had some of our zones where we had no landscape percentages at all. And then we, with some of our recent code rewrites, we actually reinstated some minimum percentage of landscape, but allowed for more flexibility so that it can potentially be used as stormwater facilities or on the rooftop and things like that. But of course, as you do that as a clear and objective path, that you start adding a lot of complexity. So that's the other thing to kind of have to think about from a balancing standpoint.
Yeah, great point. Paige?
Yeah, so from a transit standpoint, when we've requested facilities that are going to go beyond the ADA clearance, 48 inches, it depends on what right of way you're on, city or county or ODOT. ODOT's now 6 feet in some areas. Having a zero setback has really been challenging for us in many of the city centers because it doesn't allow us to then install a transit shelter, which, depending on the size of the shelter, can be anywhere from 2.5 feet to 5 feet deep, depending on, the passenger activity that we have planned or expect. I think in these areas, we're hoping to have very high passenger activity. So these shelters are large. You could probably expect something on the order of 5 by 10, 5 foot deep by 10 feet wide shelter. And then you have the associated concrete pad that's around it for ADA clearance and for the ramp to deploy. And so it's a significant piece of land that we need that often needs to go behind the sidewalk. So I would really like for us to maybe take exception or allow for the zero setback type of language to be flexible when you're looking at putting in major facilities that support transit, or even perhaps support high pedestrian activity areas that aren't necessarily a plaza or a parklet type of situation. So anyway, those are my comments. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you're referring specifically to sort of a requirement that building frontages be at the zero lot line, at the front lot line.
I have encountered that already in cities within the Rogue Valley, that in city centers where there is a zero lot line and we are not able to put in a facility. So, if setbacks are considered as part of a code language, I think there needs to be exceptions for placement of not requiring a zero setback where we're going to need a transit shelter or like a parklet or some type of, especially at intersections and corners where you have a high amount of passenger activity, not passenger and pedestrian activity. You don't want to necessarily have your buildings right up against the sidewalk because you have a lot of, people that are trying to walk and turn and then they get in the way of each other. And so you almost want to allow for those sidewalks to be wider than your typical 5-6 feet. You probably want a 10 foot or 15 foot, but even then it's difficult for us to then just smack a shelter right in it, right? Because it's an obstacle. So, so it'd be nice to have some exceptions where we can make sure that our shelters are not in the way, but they're also, encouraging that setback allowance.
Great, thanks. Steve, I see your hand up.
Thank you. Yeah, a couple of comments just building on some of the previous comments, like thinking about what Phil was saying as far as like a maximum setback. I think also like building like orientation standards, like entrance standards and things like that kind of play into that same factor. And then I guess I was going to say just broadly based on what Paige was saying, I think the need to have adjustments, like I can appreciate the value of clear and objective standards, but I also think that there's a lot of situations where it's hard to develop a one size fits all approach. And so having some kind of exceptions process or other like adjustment standards is a really important thing to go along with standards.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, Pauline, can we go back to the compactness slide real quick?
Yes, sorry, I was trying to figure out how to do that. Let me stop sharing and go back.
So I think we're getting some specific feedback on standard areas that you all want to focus on, which is great. I just want to make sure we have the opportunity to also close any of the loops that we need as a project team. And I'm looking at Pauline and Jamin here as well as the DLCD team to make sure that our universe of what we consider in this process is as sort of compatible and supportive of the various other state initiatives essentially around compactness, which have been sort of laser focused on housing compactness and in an effort to broaden housing typologies that can be built on the ground, et cetera, everything from ADUs to middle housing and beyond. But what are the ways this process can be complementary and supportive without being duplicative or confusing, given that there's a bunch of other initiatives happening?
Brian, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to comment on that last slide with the lot coverage and setbacks and landscape. And there's also floor area ratio that was mentioned. So those, it's tricky because those all interact, and different communities choose different paths sometimes to get to the same place. And then you've got several different contexts within a city where the standards are going to change. So writing one solution to that is pretty tough. I mean, you might provide several in that case, if you wanted to show that. The other thing that we've noticed is when we do equitable engagement, sometimes we are surprised about what preferences are and needs are from communities. So that's going to be, as long as cities have flexibility to choose another way to achieve the goal, that's great, because we sometimes have to react to what we're hearing.
Yep. Great point. There's an interrelatedness to a lot of these, even if they all to some extent speak to compactness. I see a hand in the DLCD room.
Yeah, just wanted to respond to a couple of points that I heard. Firstly, to respond to Brian, this is a model code, which is, the intent here is to illustrate a best practice, an approach that a city can take to addressing the 0330 standards. It's not intended to be the definitive or the required approach. So there will remain flexibility for local governments to pick and choose from this menu of options. Like if there are portions of 0330 that they like, they could take a piece of it, put it in their own code. There's no obligation to take all of it or to say this defines the requirement. So really, local governments, as they're implementing, can go back to the rules and make sure that, if they're doing a custom zone, as long as that zone comports well with the rules, I think you'll be fine. I want to go back to a little bit to, well, a couple of things. One, another thing to clarify is what we're talking about here are commercial zones throughout a community. I know we kind of talked a little bit about climate friendly areas, and of course that's a thing that I think about a lot, but really this body of work needs to make sense in commercial zones throughout the city. So there may be some differences that are made between those standards based on those commercial zones. And the last point I wanted to make to Paige's, the issues that she raised, I have seen one approach to this issue of the sidewalk width and accessible access, where you might have a more urban area so that you've got a street standard, which actually takes away the planter strip and would put in more paving and tree wells. And it creates a wider pedestrian space within the right of way before you get to the property line, in a way that can maybe accommodate transit shelters or other facilities, bike parking often. That's an approach that can work. It doesn't work in all situations, but I kind of wanted to raise that as an option that's on the table as well.
Yep, great. Okay, Pauline, if you could go back into presentation mode, I think we can, unless I don't see any other hands at the moment, unless I'm missing anyone, I think we could talk about these topics as they apply down on the ground here and make sure we crowdsource some input on which of these are going to be requiring of more full conversation with this group throughout this process. So at the district or neighborhood scale, right, which is just always helpful to remind ourselves that this is typically going to touch down when you've got a larger subdivision application for a larger site that has to be divvied up into its parts of blocks and, commercial areas and residential areas, et cetera. And so just keeping that in mind. But at the district neighborhood scale, if you go to the next, kind of cycle through some of these. So there's things like intersection density and spacing. So how frequently do local roads and collectors and pedestrian pathways and things have to kind of be available to users? The opportunity to connect to adjacent sites and anticipate connectivity of one site to another. There's some special standards for auto-oriented uses to prioritize pedestrians. So certain types of uses are going to be auto-oriented, but when they occur in these kind of area and anywhere in the city, how can we make them also accessible to pedestrians? So these kind of topics, how do you break up larger blocks with pedestrian access ways so the pedestrian routing is as direct as it can be? So on the right-hand side is sort of the long list of items that we've identified that can speak to creating more walkable standards at this district or neighborhood scale. And then one more click gets us to the topics that our team internally, and totally open to suggestions or revisions here, have flagged as potentially, being worthwhile to chew over with this group. So intersection density and spacing, right? What is the current practice there? What would be the best practice, and how should we reflect that in the model code? Similarly, the formation of blocks and street connectivity. And then auto-oriented uses for these kinds of places that can be supportive of pedestrian activity. So I want to pause and ask a couple of questions for discussion. One, at this scale, right, if we think about walkable design standards, are there topics that we've missed, right? If you were endeavoring to regulate for the purpose of creating walkable places at this scale, multi-site, district or neighborhood scale, and imagine yourself sort of looking at a subdivision application, for instance, are there standards that you already regulate or that you think would be really important to regulate at this scale that aren't represented at all on the right? And then the second question is, does it feel like the ones that we have identified are worthwhile for broader, fuller discussion with our limited time together? Pauline or Jamin, feel free to fill in if you have other questions you want the group to weigh in on.
I just wanted to clarify. I mean, when we say high priority, we'll be addressing all of these standards, but the ones that are higher priority are ones that you struggle with and have ideas and thoughts on how it's working currently or how you'd like it to work better. And they're also high priority because they're sort of the biggest bang for the buck. If we can get a really good approach, best practice identified for these standards, it'll go a long way in terms of implementing the CFEC. Carla, go ahead.
So a thought here, I like the picture. I think something that we struggle with is kind of the relationship between commercial zones and kind of how they buffer into maybe multifamily or single family around those edges. And so it seems like sometimes the commercial zones get dinged because they're adjacent to residential and then they have to do some kind of buffer yard or the height has to go down. And so we kind of lose density or some of those components that we want. And so just kind of those outer edges and how we can make those usable enough and not, so bold that the person next door who's in the single family is like, oh, great, I got this tower next to me. So kind of the balance between how that works. And then just for commercial uses specifically in terms of the allowance of mixed use in commercial zones. I mean, Medford allows for residential in our commercial. I don't know that all cities allow that, but to be able to have kind of that flexibility, I think would help too. Not necessarily that that's a top priority, but it gives people more options. So thanks. And I think your main topics are good.
Thank you.
Great.
Ryan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Just to maybe connect this topic to the previous one. Here in Corvallis, we had a block perimeter standard where development of over, I think it was 5 acres, had to create a series of local streets that the blocks couldn't be more than 1,200 feet in circumference. And a few years ago, we modified that standard and separated out vehicle blocks from pedestrian blocks and increased the vehicle block perimeter maximum, to 2,400 feet. And the idea really was walkability, thinking that the smaller the blocks that you're requiring, the more right of way you're going to be dedicating. And the more right of way you're dedicating, the further you're spreading things out. And so it kind of connects to the previous topic of kind of density and connectedness. And so just an idea for that kind of ties this topic to the previous one is thinking about how much right of way you're really dedicating.
Great. Yeah, that sounds like an interesting standard for us to dig into. Eunice?
Great. I was thinking about how this is going to apply pretty broadly in cities, like all commercial areas, all mixed use areas, right? And a lot of cities like in Salem are largely developed with underutilized properties in our commercial zones. And so one thing we always struggle with is how do we transition these properties? Like how do you make it so that a standard for whether it's setbacks or whether it's orientation of buildings or pedestrian connections, as they're slowly infilling or redeveloping portions or making improvements, how do you move these properties closer to the ideal without disrupting the whole thing, making it totally not feasible, et cetera. And so if there's any way to kind of think through how that applies to properties that don't look like this already and how to get them closer, that'd be really helpful.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think we said this earlier, but and I think it's obvious, but always worth a reminder, since it will come up in any sort of public engagement that's done, that code standards that are implemented after something is already built really only get triggered if there's a redevelopment application or things like that. Or if it's a greenfield ground up development. That said, thinking about when you apply these new standards onto an existing context, how can they be how can an existing property get repositioned, and how do the standards influence properties as they transition from one sort of orientation, like an auto orientation, for instance, to another orientation, I think is part of our focus on implementation and administration and things like that. So I think that might be one that we flag to make sure we've covered in the criteria section of the presentation here. Things that we need to remind ourselves to check as we go forward.
Great, thanks.
Anyone else on this one before we drill down to the next layer here? Oh, we got Phil.
Yeah, one thing that we've had to grapple with, I mean, this touches on quite a few different things, at least in my mind. But first off, you guys brought up the fact that we are dealing with site planning and regulations on private sites versus, street and right-of-way standards. And for us, we basically have two bureaus. One is, planning, sustainability, and development services that reviews stuff on private sites, and then PBOT works on trying to help with developing the street network. And we come up with street plans, but they're very hard to implement unless you have a huge area that you can kind of master plan. And so we're always finding, if something's redeveloping and it's saying, luckily in a lot of parts of Portland, our street network is very well connected, but you go a little further east or into the Southwest Hills, you don't have that connectivity, but you also are not getting a 8-acre, 10-acre site coming in for a development. You're getting a redevelopment of a strip mall. And so, it's hard to come up with something, even if it's a pedestrian network, because it's not necessarily leading anywhere. It's leading to somebody's backyard behind them. And so that's the kind of thing we're having to kind of grapple with, where I don't think our ability to create more pedestrian oriented and connected neighborhoods has been able to work as well in these sort of East Portland areas that maybe were developed semi-rural in the 50s and are now developing at a much greater density, but you find you're traveling quite a long distance before you hit an intersecting street because everything's getting developed piecemeal. So that's the one thing. The other thing I wanted to kind of point out that this touches on a little bit but it also gets back to that the building orientation stuff that we did with the building is I feel like we've done a good job with our regulations about how buildings orient and on our transit streets, if there's entrances on the transit street. But when development is built, kind of like the illustration you have there where the parking lot's in the back, it ends up becoming more of a enforcement and management issue where if it's a commercial tenant, they're gonna have their entrance facing the street, or maybe facing the street and also facing the parking lot. But then operationally, they start closing off the doors to the street because they can only control, and with security issues the way they've been lately, we're finding, more and more of this kind of the buildings right up to the street, but the orientation of the internal layout and how the thing operates is from the parking lot. So I don't know that there's a solution to this, but it's just something that we've had to continuously kind of grapple with.
Yeah, great points. Great points. I think one of the philosophies I think implied in a lot of this work is that if you abide by the model code, then it doesn't preclude walkable behavior. And I think, if you have the opportunity, the requirement of an entrance on the street, then you have the opportunity to activate the street with it. The operational considerations are very real. But that's a tricky one for this project to solve. But by not having that entrance on the street, then that building's going to be there for 50 years and you'll never have that opportunity. So, but that's a very real consideration. Let's drill down one more layer deeper here, unless we have another question. Okay, great. So we've got our big site has been carved into blocks. Those blocks have been carved into lots. Next slide. So there's a combination of some residential lots on the back and two commercial lots on the front. Next slide. So at the block level, which could have a variety of land uses. It will have multiple lots, most likely. There's a variety of issues that come up from a walkable design perspective. So block length and perimeter, which was mentioned a minute ago. Next. Garage orientation. So is it oriented towards an alley or is it oriented towards a main street? Next. Auto entrances on secondary streets. So, trying to prioritize or restrict the location of driveways and auto entrances. Next. And then alley standards, right? Whether those are encouraged or required, shared parking allowances. Next. So we've identified a whole host of code related topics that really come into play when we're looking at this block scale. And if you hit the next slide, we've flagged several of these that we think there could be, well, as Pauline mentioned, the model code, we intend to address all of the code related topics since we have you all for a limited amount of time. There could be a variety of different approaches to some of these things that we want to have a chance to chew over together. There could be some best practice considerations that may not be represented with what you all are doing in your jurisdictions. So here's what we have as a preliminary flagged list of topic areas. So again, the same set of questions. If you're looking at a development application that has a block within it, right? Or is being subdivided down into blocks, the standards that you would be looking to for to try and regulate this imaginary place in a way that could be more walkable. Have we captured all of those potential code related and standards on the right? And then also, are we flagging the ones that you think are the most worthwhile for discussion with the TAC? And just a reminder, the OARs are not as specific. They don't provide the specific standards that would implement the policy that's stated. So we are using our professional judgment and also doing a little bit of crowdsourcing from the model code for small cities to populate this list on the right. But you all are practitioners and can help us round out the big list that will be included in the model code, but also what we want to discuss as a group. Anything at the block level that's a standard that would influence walkable design. I see Brian's hand.
Sorry, I'm really slow with my buttons today. I'm sure this is on your radar, so this isn't really an answer, but one of the challenges that we have with existing development and existing neighborhoods is we have no idea how to define block with all the curvy, winding streets. Like, you just can't tell what a block is. We wanted to actually use the word block to do a regulation, and we had to abandon the idea because it was impossible to define. So I know that a lot of these are intended for new development, but depending on the trigger and when if something's big enough to apply, I just wanted to point that out.
Yep. Good point. It's always good to hear how the struggles you are having when you try to implement some of these regulations on the ground, because there's more lessons from what isn't going well than there probably are from what is going well. So thank you for sharing. Anyone else have feedback on the block level walkable design standards? Conscious of time, Pauline. So if you want to move us along, we can always circle back. And again, you will have this content following this meeting. And if you wake up tomorrow morning or the day after or before, we need the feedback on it, and you have an idea for a glaring omission that we did not cover on the right, you'll have the opportunity to help us fill in those gaps. So let's drill down one final layer deeper here. Okay, so within a lot within a block, there are sites or lots, and certain standards apply just on the site level or on the lot level. And so Primary entrances, those were brought up today, and it sounds like there's some practices that are happening in certain jurisdictions that you all feel like are going pretty well, at least from a design perspective, maybe not as much from an operational perspective. Next. Building orientation, right? So what's the hierarchy of edges to a lot, and how do you orient activity on the primary ones? Next. Parking placement, requiring parking to be placed to the side or back so that the active uses can help activate the primary frontages. Next. Parking lot design, right? This is a topic that is the reason we all get up in the morning, but it is actually a pretty important component to this. So this process is how parking can be designed to actually facilitate safe pedestrian movements across the site and to adjacent sites as well. Next. Walkway standards. So there's standards around, the edges of a site, but also through a site. So with a focus on pedestrian orientation. So this, I think, the lot and site, so I'll just use lot. The lot standards are ones that I think most people, when they think of zoning, are clued into, because typically when you're pulling a permit for redevelopment or you've already got a lot platted, you're going to encounter all these more common standards. And so this is an arena where I feel like we probably have a lot of examples, both good and bad, to pull from the jurisdictions. There's a lot of tried and true zoning standards here, but the ones that we've flagged for potential further discussion with this group are building and parking orientation, right? So how to building space and parking compete and get prioritized for different parts of a site and frontages. Setbacks, we talked about that already, that's come up. Density of building height, lot size and coverage, primary entrances and transparency. So sort of the experience from the street from a pedestrian. And then parking lot design, and then transit and mobility amenities. So how does a site and its design respond to adjacent transit facilities? Again, the questions are, or is anything missing from the right, in the universe of potential code standards that could influence walkability at a site level? And then are there any recommendations for either pulling items off the list or adding them to the list for fuller discussion? Carla.
I think the only thing that may need to be added, assuming that, not all commercial zones are like in a downtown or in maybe a specific district that are up to the sidewalk, landscaping, I think needs to be kind of added.
Great. Good one. Anyone else see any omissions, or anyone want to offer any sort of prioritization for our group's time together in subsequent meetings? Phil.
I'll just say real quickly, because one thing I did notice in 330 is there is a reference to the bike parking requirements, the bike parking standards, that I think, forget which section is that, you have to ensure that development is meeting those provisions. So my only thought was the fact that we're addressing 0330 may mean that we also have to kind of take a look at 0630 and see if there's anything there that could influence what we're showing here on the site design.
Pauline, anything you want to add to that comment?
No, I think that's a great point. The level of details here is immense. So thanks for bringing that.
Okay, so let's, for the sake of time, and because you all will have time to spend with this at your leisure over the coming days to provide us with any final feedback, let's move to the next slide, which is, so we talked about how these standards apply at different scales, but there's also a thematic component to some of these things. And we introduced this framing a little bit earlier in the presentation, but just to underline that we've organized these same set of code topics into these themes. So pedestrian oriented, compact, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So if it's helpful to think about either one, either at scale or at a theme level, we would welcome feedback on both. And just I'll pause to see if there's any reactions to this way of framing this information. And if you feel like there's any glaring omissions that we haven't talked about, seeing it organized in this fashion. And Pauline or Jamin, if you want to fill in any specific questions related to this, feel free. Okay, we spent a lot of time talking about the compact development patterns question, and I think there's more discussion and thinking that needs to be done on what are exactly the right set of code dials to be included in that bundle in the model code. We have a pretty laser focus on the pedestrian-oriented site design standards. That seems to be a pretty central focus with a lot of different code dials that could be turned here. So I think just buckle up. That'll probably be a chunk of future discussions, those two in particular. But then connectivity applying to those larger contexts is equally important, but maybe more applicable when you get into the sort of larger site subdivisions. So last but not least from my section, just want to daylight the next slide here, the evaluation criteria. So we always think that it's helpful to kind of come back to a set of objectives for our projects, and the ones that we've identified thus far, and welcome any feedback on these, are as we think about these standards and the model approaches, are they clear? Can we understand them? Do they achieve the right urban design outcomes, right? So thinking about the outcomes first. Are they in service of and achieve the broader set of goals related to housing and transportation choice? Do they result in more inclusive and accessible communities for people on 2 feet or 2 wheels, et cetera? Are they easy for you to implement and administer? Are they flexible enough? Do they have ranges associated with them or context descriptions that are flexible enough to allow them to react to varying contexts? And then what is the effect on development costs and feasibility? So thinking about whether these standards are buildable. Is there anything missing that we should sort of remind ourselves as we go through this process about how we should be measuring the standards? Any obvious omissions that we want to talk about now? If not, we can keep rolling so that we have time to provide instructions on the survey and the homework assignment. Okay, well, we can always take feedback on these after this meeting. I don't want to shortchange the rest of the presentation though, Pauline, so keep us rolling.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sticking with us. We just provided an enormous amount of information and peppered you with questions. So that is, we have a lot of questions and we love active, engaged discussion. So thanks for participating in that with us. I do want to just pause before we get into next steps to see if anyone had any broader questions that have come up for them related to the slides we've shown. So I'm just going to pause for a second to see if anyone has any questions before I walk through our next steps. Okay, great. Well, I always have to make space for that because I like to move quickly, so I have to remember to slow down. But I have my email address and we'll share this slide deck with you, and you'll have my email address. I'm always available to answer any questions that come up throughout this process. So where are we headed next? First of all, we wanted to give you a homework assignment. So as I said, we're going to provide these presentation slides to you, and we're going to have a Google Drive folder set up. There's this hyperlink. So once you have the slides, you'll be able to click on this hyperlink and you can access any of the materials for the TAC meetings. Those are going to be view only. So once we get into materials in the future where we're trying to get comments back from you and you can interact and edit those files directly, we'll be providing you a different link for those. But this is going to be a set aside folder for the TAC material. So anything that we've presented to you, you'll have full access to at that folder. So we walk through those high priority topics, the standards associated with them. And then we also talked about the evaluation criteria. So what are those criteria that we'll be applying to the different standards to help us make choices as we provide this toolkit for you all. So if you have any thoughts on that, feel free to provide any of that feedback or ask those questions to us a week from today. So by next Wednesday, March 13th, to email us any feedback that you have on that. And then we'll make sure to present anything that's changed or updated the next time we meet with you. So our next meeting with you, we're targeting the second week of April, and we'll come out with a meeting request for that time shortly here. But so that's where we're headed is, so your homework assignment and what we'll be working at that second TAC is online survey. And I'm going to let Tara walk you through it in a moment here and sort of user test it for you. But we're going to ask for that survey for you to participate and get all of your materials into it by March 20th. So I'm just going to highlight that, give you a chance to write it down. So your homework assignment is going to be due Wednesday, March 20th, and it's an online survey. So with that said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Tara. So Tara is going to walk you through a survey and what we're hoping to achieve through it, and give you a chance to see it so you know what you're going to have coming into your inbox later tomorrow.
Thank you, Pauline. And thanks again, everybody, for the time you're giving us today. We're almost through it. We'll let you go soon. But the survey that we will send you will look like this when you open it. And it's about 6 pages, but there are quite a few questions. So be sure to give yourself enough time to really sit down and have time to kind of look through your code and copy things into it. It'll definitely take, more than just a few minutes. So we appreciate the time in advance. The first part of this is kind of an overview, again, reintroducing those topics and some of these standards. We understand that you may or may not have some of these standards in your code, so please do your best to fill in all the questions that you can. But of course, if it doesn't exist in your code, feel free to skip that question. So we've got our contact here, Pauline, if you have any questions regarding the survey, and then we also have the due date reminder there on the front page as well. When you go into the actual survey itself on the next page, again, each page is going to be organized into each of those 5 topics. You'll have an overview of the OAR intent of that topic, and then it'll go into each specific standard type and ask you some specific questions. So for this one, we've got building and parking orientation standards or build to lines. And reading through some of these questions, let's think this one might pop out to me. So does your code require a minimum percentage of street facing facade to be built at the front of the lot to encourage street frontage? So I'm going to use Milwaukee as an example. One thing here is that it will tell you generally about where in a code you may find these standards. So this said commercial or mixed use. So in Milwaukee, that's where I went. And then you can kind of search for any keywords to help you find what you need. I know that this one has frontage occupancy. So I would look to figure out where it is, and it's here. So I'm going to copy these standards over into the second question where it says to describe these. And then we will need the citation. So you would just go in and figure out what that is, copy it over, and you can edit for which section. It'll continue to ask you things. Everything is pretty much copy and paste. If you have any questions or you run out of space to paste things in, please let us know. But again, we understand there's a lot of interconnected standards that may happen throughout the code. So again, if you're struggling to fill anything out, please let us know. But definitely feel free to just copy and paste. I think that is it, Pauline, unless you have additional to add.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in real quickly, Eunice, and then I'll answer your question. So our intent here is to try to start to cull these best practices. So first and foremost, we're trying to get your help identifying if you have these standards related to these intents, And then help us understand where they are specifically in your code, because we always have to think both about what is the code standard, but where would it live within the code long term. And so that citation also helps us to answer that. But as you notice, there's a graphic associated with this code. Often there's going to be graphics. That's great. No need to copy and paste that over. We have this citation, so we know exactly where to look at in your code. You know, if there's 12 members of the TAC, 12 different codes, all with different content and organizational structures. This just helps orient us as we have discussions if we want to go back with further follow-up questions. And then actually, Tara, do you mind scrolling down? So we're asking for specific citations and standards, getting at that interrelatedness, if there's any other relevant standards. Again, this is sort of real Russian nesting doll. There's many different standards. They're all related. Do your best. I wouldn't try too hard to get everything in the right spot. That'll be our job to sort through and frame them up for you at our future TAC meeting. But I do want to point out that we ask 3 questions for each time. And so that's getting sort of toward our evaluation criteria. And we're asking you this because you're the code practitioners. You see the applications come in, you know what the issues are. You know if a standard isn't really working well for you. You know if it's hard to implement and administer. Do applicants always have questions? Does it always get variances asked for it? You know, what's not working? And that'll come up in if they're easy to implement, if people are raising concerns about these, if variances are needed. And so these are really just open-ended questions to give you a chance to share your experience as practitioners to help us understand what is or is not working well. And Eunice, did you still have a question?
Oh, I was just wondering, did you want every instance of all of those standards, every zone, or just one good example? Or
so that's a great question. And that's sort of where we started initially struggling with the compact development question. So if it's the type of standard that there's many different, you know, it's not really helpful to copy in the setback for every single zone, right? I think it's more those higher order standards that apply across zones, or if it's the best one that you want to share with us, the one that you think that's really doing well and really applicable for the CFEC area of inquiry, then I would copy that in. Go ahead, Cody, or whomever.
That's me again. Just a quick question. If, you know, some of us are real planning nerds, and if we know of a good standard that another jurisdiction does, I would think we would be open to that input as well. We just want you to clarify which jurisdiction. For example, I really liked Eugene's parking lot standards. I worked there 20 years ago, but that might be a good example too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That'd be great. And, you know, our initial foray is going to be into the current best practices as you're always adapting and adjusting your code language. And really excited to get into that next round also of best practices, whether they're in Oregon State or farther flung. So yeah, there'll be lots of opportunity to provide your greatest hits, if you will, of code. Does anyone else have any other questions about that homework assignment? Great. Well, if questions do come up again, feel free to reach out. Really appreciate time with everyone today. I think it's going to be an absolutely fascinating process, and really excited to get a chance to work on it with all of you and get to know you and your city codes better. So thanks again for your time and for spending it with us today. And we will see you back in April here.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.